Great. Thank you so much, Brad.
Well, thanks, John. I appreciate it. Let me just, there I go. Click that button, make that move away. Yeah, what all that introductory stuff really means is that I've killed many a good cocktail party by talking about things that people don't want to hear in a whole lot of detail, but you all are different. So thank you for taking the time to join. And what makes you different is you are appreciating that you and your company are either offering a plan or want to offer a plan and realize that you have to do it the right way. ERISA is the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, the law that governs private sector benefits for both private sector companies as well as non-governmental nonprofits. So, you know, your nonprofit space, your private business space. This is the law that tells you how to behave, how to run your plan, what it is you have to do right, and also by implication, what you can do wrong, that's going to cause problems for your workers. And the thing to remember before we get into some of the details about that is that you need to think of ERISA as kind of the ultimate other people's money statute. It's sort of hyper protective. To understand where it comes from, this law was passed in the early 70s, and that followed about 20 years of Congress trying to tweak the laws to make things better, because what you had before that were cases of a lot of labor racketeering where people were stealing from pension plans. There's kind of a joke that's only partially funny about Vegas having been built in part on misappropriated pension funds. There is actually some truth to that. So if you want a homework assignment, go watch the movie Casino with De Niro. Anyway, in response partly to that, but also to very serious issues like companies going bankrupt and their retirees being creditors like anybody else, standing in line for pennies on the dollar. Congress said, look, that's not working. We have to have a special law that's going to treat these things differently. And so with ERISA's passage, they really created a special set of conditions, and they're all about protecting ordinary folks' retirement money. And the key to all of it, frankly, is the fiduciary. And that's essentially kind of a tweak on trust law that they put in place so that there would be a person or a committee, or at a minimum the company, who was liable for making sure things were done properly. And so what I thought we'd talk about a little bit today is kind of what it means to be a fiduciary, what makes you a fiduciary, how you carry out those duties, and also a little bit about some of the plan options that are facing you. Because one of the blessings of ERISA is that it lets you design a retirement plan that really works for your company and that fits your needs as an employer, but also your employees' needs for their retirements and where they are as workers. Because obviously companies have very different populations. You know, what might be right for one company that's full of engineers might be different for another company that's full of factory workers. You know, their needs and how you would approach them could be very different. ERISA gives you the flexibility to design a plan that works for your employees, that works for your company. That's the blessing. The curse of ERISA is that you actually have to follow all the rules that fit the form you've selected. So you have the flexibility to custom design things, but then that means you have to run things in that custom manner. But fortunately, ERISA gives you some options that run the gamut from, you know, a purely individually custom design option to an off-the-shelf option. And so we'll talk a little bit about how some of those fit together. But first, let's talk about this key notion of being a fiduciary. So what the law says is that you need to have a written plan document. In other words, for your plan to comply with the rules, you have to write down what's supposed to happen. And there's obviously a bunch of requirements about what needs to be in there. One of the things that's supposed to be in there is the identification of what's called a named fiduciary. And this is basically the person or the committee who is charged with making sure everything is being done properly. Kind of that's where the fiduciary authority originally rests. That person or committee, and you could write in there that it could be a title, you know, it could be the CFO, or you could write in there that it will be the fiduciary committee. And then you can establish a fiduciary committee of people who will meet and, you know, make these decisions as a group. You know, there's again variety in how you want to set that up. But those folks are responsible for running the plan, for hiring service providers, for selecting investments, for doing all of that. But obviously that's a huge job, right? So you would look at that and say, well, wait, if I'm a fiduciary, how am I supposed to do all this stuff that I'm not an expert in all these things? How am I supposed to do all these things and do them correctly? And fortunately, the law takes that into account as well. So you have a couple of specific duties as fiduciaries if you break down what it means to run things. One of those is that you need to follow the plan document. So if you say your plan is supposed to do X, then you're supposed to run it and do X. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples of where we commonly see problems. And this is why we suggest that you review your plan document periodically, by which we mean, every year or 2 years, take a look, make sure things are running the way they should. An example of common problems are things like your plan probably defines compensation. Your plan probably defines eligibility. One of the common errors we see is that you change record keepers, for example. You hire a new service provider, a new record keeper, and for good and logical reasons, you do that. It makes sense, but maybe they're applying a slightly different definition of compensation or a slightly different definition of eligibility. And you may even have thought that that was the right one and you've agreed to the change. But if you haven't changed your plan document, then you're now technically out of sync with the document, and that's by itself a violation. And you don't want to have violations for a variety of reasons. So that's an example. One of the duties is to follow the plan documents and run the plan in accordance with them. Another one is to diversify investments, so to minimize the risk of large losses. I think that's pretty obvious on the face of it. You can't go out and run the company retirement plan by investing everything in Russian equities. That is not the way you're supposed to make those types of decisions. But the key, really, the core of being a fiduciary is what the law calls prudence. Technically, the law actually still says it's the prudent man standard. And that's actually written in the statute in 1974, where they didn't use gender neutral terminology. And for whatever reason, Congress, even though it's amended the section a few times, has never gone back and tweaked that part. But let's just call it the prudent person theory. What it really says is that we're going to judge the decisions that a fiduciary makes, not in hindsight, not against some perfect model or ideal. What we're going to do is say, what would a prudent person who is standing in your shoes at your plan, making a decision that you had to make at the time you had to make it, what would they do? So in other words, we're not saying after the fact did the market go up and down. We're looking at it saying, okay, as of today, you have to make a decision about what sorts of investments to put in your plan. So did you ask the right questions? Did you look at the right information? If you didn't know how to do something, for example, you're not an expert in investment decision making, did you find experts to help you do so? And that's why one of the most common advisors that we see to a plan are financial advisors. Most plan fiduciaries will hire a financial advisor to help them make these investment decisions, because most fiduciaries to plans are not themselves investment experts. So for example, did you hire an investment advisor to help you make those decisions prudently? So the question becomes not, did I make the right decision? The question is, how did you make the decision? Did you make the decision the right way? And so this is really the protection of ERISA for fiduciaries. What the law says is, if you make the decisions the right way, i.e. a prudent way, then you are deemed to have made a prudent decision. You've complied with your duty, even if you turn out to be wrong. So put another way, you can be wrong as long as you're wrong the right way. And that's actually really part of the core, the core to being an ERISA fiduciary is process and documentation. And if you've ever had the misfortune to hear an ERISA attorney like myself talk before, you've probably heard them say process and documentation. It's kind of the mantra that we repeat because that really is the core of what it means to be an ERISA fiduciary. So putting it this way, when you make investment decisions for your plan, when you select service providers for your plan, when you do those kinds of things, you need to employ a prudent, thorough, and well-documented process. So why well-documented? Well, if I have to make the decision this year about which investments to pick, and let's say I'm on a committee and there's 4 of us who are on the investment committee, 5 years from now, when somebody decides we did it wrong and we get sued, for example, maybe I'm gone. Maybe somebody else has replaced me. Maybe of the 4 of us, there are only 3 left or 1 left. Over 5 years, a lot has happened. So if we didn't write down what we did and why we did it, then it's almost as if we didn't have that process. We can't prove that we had that thorough, prudent, well-documented process. And that's why one of the keys for fiduciary actions is having minutes for committee meetings, having at least annually a committee meeting, so that you can show that we did follow the rules, that we did have a process, that we did consider these issues and made a decision and did so prudently. So all of that combined kind of goes to how you approach some of those things. One other important thing you need to understand about being a fiduciary, and that is you're a fiduciary under ERISA based on your conduct more so than your status. So what do I mean by that? Well, I said before that in the plan documents, you can write in a named fiduciary. Well, that's true. In that case, you have written down a person or a group, or whatever, that is going to be the fiduciary. So they have that authority. They possess it. So they have a duty to use it properly. And if they don't use it at all, for example, they just don't do anything, that can be a violation because they have that authority. But in most of the other cases, fiduciary authority is based on function. In other words, did I do fiduciary things? And the reason that's written that way is so that you can't have somebody who avoids responsibility for being a fiduciary, for actually making a decision, by claiming that it wasn't their job. So if, for example, you hire a service provider, or if you pick a plan investment for the plan menu, no matter what your title is, whether you're on the committee or not, whether your contract with your employer says, I am not, never will be a fiduciary, under the law, if you actually made the decision, if you exercised fiduciary discretion, then you're considered a fiduciary and responsible, at least for that decision over which you had discretion. So all of that means when you approach running your 401k plan or your 403b plan or whichever other kind of retirement plan you're considering, you need to start out with the notion of, yes, we want this plan. We want to have certain types of benefits. We want to offer them to certain types of employees consistent with the law. There's some flexibility on that. And we know how we're going to govern it. We know who's going to be responsible for doing it. We don't want accidental fiduciaries. We don't want people who make a decision not realizing their duties, because that's the kind of thing that can lead to mistakes and problems and expense in trying to fix those mistakes after the fact. So that's kind of a quick overview of your duties as fiduciaries in the broad sense. But what about in the specific sense? Well, on any given year, there are actually a lot of deadlines and particular responsibilities that plans need to carry out. Now, many of these will be handled for you by service providers you select. For example, when you hire a record keeper, they're going to help you file a lot of forms and notices that are required. You could hire a third-party administrator who could help you administer some of the benefits and keep track of some of the paperwork. There's a variety of different service providers you could hire to help you do that. But one of the other questions to consider is on the front end, plan design. I mentioned at the beginning, there's a spectrum of activity. So for example, when you file the form 5500, which if you think of it, is kind of like the annual tax return for a retirement plan. You need to file that every year with the Department of Labor. It's used by IRS, labor, and some other governmental entities for information about the plan. That's due on a particular day, and there's an extension, kind of just like regular taxes. But if you don't file those, there are penalties. Again, just like regular taxes, only they can be fairly significant. So you need to make sure as a fiduciary that those are being filed. And in particular, it's the duty of the plan administrator, which is a type of fiduciary for the plan, to file that 5500. There are also notice requirements. You have to send participants an annual notice. In a 401k plan, you have to send them quarterly benefit statements. Failure to send those statements can have various types of civil and other penalties. So if you put all this together, there's a lot of moving parts to running a plan. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a spectrum of how involved you want to be and different plan designs that have evolved over time to accommodate your interests. So as I said, you could have a completely custom designed plan where everything happens specifically the way you want it. Obviously, there's some universal things you have to do, but you've set it up the way you want it to run, and you're now responsible for each aspect of that. There's kind of another set of solutions, which I kind of put in the do it for me camp. And there's a variety of newer options, not necessarily new in the sense they hadn't existed in the last couple of years, but legislation since 2019 has really expanded the opportunities for these different pooled arrangements. So examples are multiple employer plans, which you'll hear called MEPs, pooled employer plans, which you might hear called PEPs. There's lots of acronyms in this space, but what these sort of pooled arrangements do is they say, well, instead of each company having to run its own plan and be responsible for doing all of those things themselves, and the fiduciaries in each plan doing it all for themselves and being liable for all that, what if we set up a situation where there were essentially professional managers, where a bunch of employers could join together and have a plan, or at least have the same structure of plan, so that instead of each of us having to do everything for ourselves, we could have a unified plan that we all belong to. And that reduces the amount of individual effort that each employer, and thus each fiduciary at each employer, has to engage in. Now, you are never out of the fiduciary woods entirely. If someone tells you you are, that should be a warning flag, because at a minimum, you're always responsible for, at your company, saying, do we want to join one of these arrangements, and reviewing the different options, looking at the pricing, and looking at the fees to determine whether they're reasonable, and of course making the decision to join. You're also, as a fiduciary, liable for making sure you send in the contributions from participants on time. But if you're in one of these pooled arrangements like MEPs and PEPs, it can set up a situation where instead of me, you, us, the fiduciary, having to do everything, many of those responsibilities, like filing the Form 5500, like getting an audit of the plan on an annual basis if you have more than 100 participants, like sending out all of the disclosures that need to be sent out to all the participants on the timeframes they need to be sent out. All of that can be done by the plan for you in a MEP or a PEP, rather than you doing it yourself. Now, these are not the right solutions for everybody. You need to look at the different options and decide. It's worth noting in California, you have, I'm sure you're familiar with CalSavers, which is a new idea that essentially says, hey, if you don't have a retirement plan, Mr. and Mrs. Employer, we're going to make you have a payroll deduction IRA program. And I think it's worth noting that while that is the law in California, and you are going to have to abide by that, you should really look at the options and decide what makes the most sense for your company. While that payroll deduction IRA is a form of sort of retirement option, it's not an ERISA plan, and it has lower contribution limits. In other words, you can't save nearly as much with it, which limits its utility to the owners of business and their family members. It doesn't let you save as much, it isn't as flexible, and it's run by the state, which I think, well, I don't know. I don't live in California. I'll let you characterize your own state government as you see fit. But I personally would rather have a little more control over my destiny than trusting the state to, especially California, to run it for me. But hey, I'll leave that up to you to decide. My point is, if you're in a situation like California where they're saying you have to have some sort of retirement offering for your workers or use our state program, there are a lot of new options out there, especially with various pooled arrangements, that make it much easier for employers to offer retirement plans than it used to, and that may be a much more beneficial alternative, not only for the business owner, but also, frankly, for the individual workers, for the participants, than a program like CalSavers can be. So I know I've rambled on a bit. Maybe it's a good point to sort of slow down and stop and see if we have questions and deal with particular issues. But I'll just wrap it up by saying the key to being an ERISA fiduciary is to do it intentionally, to make sure you're being thorough, to ask the right questions, and remember that at the end of the day, you're not expected to be an expert. You're just expected to follow a good process in making decisions, and that you have a lot of options for how you set up benefits with your plan. And it's worth exploring those before you commit to one, given that this is important. I mean, to not sound trite or corny, you're doing something that really matters here. You're providing retirement security to the folks, to yourself, to your colleagues, to the folks who work for you. This is something that's worth doing right, because it really does matter to all of us. And so with that, maybe I should stop talking and see where we are, if some questions or other issues we ought to address here today.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. First of all, hello, Dan. It's John. His question is, are there substantive differences between 401ks and 403bs? I'll let you take that, but we could talk about that more offline, Dan. But go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, there are. One of the key differences is that 403b plans, generally speaking, have been used more in the nonprofit space, although they are often eligible for 401ks as well. Historically, 403bs have been funded through annuity contracts and 401ks through other investments, although again, there's been some convergence on that issue as well. Another difference is 401ks can use collective trusts as a form of investment, and that's still not available in 403bs. Both of those can be very good choices for retirement plans. The reason I think, John, you were saying it's part of a longer discussion is it does become an individualized question. If you're an employer who could use a plan sponsor is the word I should be using instead of employer. If you're going to be a plan sponsor and you're eligible for either type, you do need to look at them and decide. But there is less distinction between them than there has been historically. Over the past 10 years, they've become more interchangeable.
Yeah, I think when the new 403b regs came out January 1st of 2009, they really didn't want the wild west of individual annuities for individual people in a 403b. Now they want you to have a plan document, adoption agreement, SPD. So they really have come together.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the things that as you put it, in the Wild West before, that made 403bs for example, cheaper option, less regulated option, that really isn't the case. In part, what happened, I was actually at the Labor Department when we changed some of these rules, and they made parallel changes at the IRS. Our enforcement showed that whether it was a nonprofit or a for-profit entity, I mean, whether it's, I don't know, what would be a good example? Bob's dog shelter versus Bob's bicycle shop. Both of those entities had similar types of violations. If they ran short on money, the contributions didn't always make it to the plan. And so at the end of the day, the government decided we really need the same rules governing these plans so that we equally protect workers in both of them. And as you say, for over 10 years now, they've been very similar.
As a plan sponsor, what should I be thinking about heading into 2024?
Well, this is a part I didn't get into. We just had a major new law passed, which some of you probably heard of. We're calling it the Secure Act 2.0. Well, technically the law says Secure 2.0 Act, which kind of gives you an indication that it does have a few drafting issues. It puts in place a few new requirements, but a lot of new options. And that's something that plan sponsors need to pay some attention to. There are some mandatory features in this new law, and many of those start taking effect next year in 2024. But there are a lot of new optional provisions. And just a couple I'll mention. Please. There's an option beginning 2024 where you don't have to do it, but you can, where you can allow student loan payments that your employees make to count as if they were elective contributions to the plan for matching purposes. So in other words, your 20-something employees who have tons of student loan debt and who are having to, in their minds at least, choose between repaying their student loans or contributing to their 401k plan, this is a way for you to make a matching contribution in their plan, even though they haven't necessarily made their own contribution. So for example, $5,000 in student loan payments might allow you to match as if they had made $5,000 in contributions. So it's a new option that for some plans is very attractive. Another new option there are some Roth options. And just briefly, so we're all on the same page, when we say a Roth tax treatment, In a traditional 401k or 403b, what we think of traditional tax treatment, if I make a contribution, my contribution is taken out of my taxable income this year. So if I contribute $10,000 to the plan, it's as if I made $10,000 less for tax purposes this year. The employer gets to take the $10,000 deduction that they paid me as, for wages or any matching in the current year. The money inside my account grows tax-free until I take it out. And when I take it out at a distribution down near retirement, hopefully not until age 59 and a half to avoid a penalty, but when I take the money out, then I'm taxed at ordinary income. So traditional is no tax now, more tax later. The Roth flips that model around, and under Roth tax treatment, I put in after-tax money. So in other words, that $10,000 I contributed, I pay tax on this year, but it grows tax-free and it comes out tax-free. So Roth treatment, pay tax now, no tax later. The new law is giving employers the opportunity to give their employees a choice to get employer money in Roth as well. And that's not been a choice we've had previously. Plans have been able to adopt Roth for employee contributions if they wanted. Now they can adopt it for employer contributions if they want to. There's also a wrinkle, and this is causing a little bit of question. And again, as an example of why some of these things are complex and can be somewhat difficult to administer, starting next year, the good news is that catch-up contributions, which are extra contributions that folks above a certain age are allowed to make because they're near retirement, so they get a chance to sock a little more away. Those catch-up contributions for folks between 60 and 64 are increasing by about 50%. That's the good news. The bad news is that to pay for all the other parts of the bill, Congress said that if your worker makes more than $145,000 a year for FICA purposes, that's the test they use, then they can only make catch-up contributions on a Roth basis. So if your plan currently doesn't have Roth, but it does accept catch-up contributions, then starting next year in 2024, folks who are going to be able to make catch-up contributions, but who make more than 145,000 are going to either your plan's going to have to turn off catch-up contributions or turn on Roth. And so there's some change that comes that you're going to have to pay attention to as a result of that. So there's several other provisions. I mean, the Secure Act 2.0 was a big bill. It had 92 provisions. It's created several more optional provisions and several more mandatory. Frankly, we could spend 2 hours just talking about it. But those are some issues. If you haven't been talking to your advisors and your record keepers about Secure Act, you should start, because there's some things you want to look at this summer, this fall, as options or mandatory changes that could take effect as early as next January.
Another question, and actually just a comment to kind of piggyback on what you were saying before about CalSavers. I'm not sure how familiar you are with it here in California. As you said earlier, the maximum is the IRA maximum, $6,500 compared to $22,500 for a 401k plan. I looked at the investments for CalSavers, and it looks like they basically copied what Massachusetts did, and it's all State Street investments. As a fiduciary, what is your feeling on just having a fund menu that's all from one fund company? Can that get you into trouble?
It can, and generally it's not what we see. What we typically see is in a normal ERISA plan, which CalSavers is not. Again, it's not subject to ERISA, which is how it can do things that frankly wouldn't be entirely prudent in an ERISA plan. In a normal ERISA plan, you would be looking for, I don't want to say the best, because that's not exactly the right phrase. That implies there's only one answer, and that's not the case. But a prudent fiduciary would be looking across all the reasonably available investments and trying within each sector of investment they're using to identify ones that are, again, prudent. And you're really looking for, I don't want to say best in class, but kind of that notion. And so sometimes that might be State Street, sometimes it might be Fidelity, sometimes it might be Federated, sometimes it might be insert the fund company of your choice. You really need to look at those as individualized decisions for the plan. So, is CalSavers better than nothing for an employee in a company that doesn't have a plan? Sure, but it really is the basest model type of a It's not even technically a retirement benefit you can get. I just think when companies sit down, when they're faced with the choice of do we do CalSavers or do we do something else, the something else is almost always going to be a more attractive and better option if you really look at the numbers.
Yeah, and I think this is so important because a lot of companies, they don't have DB plans anymore. And really, what are people going to have when they retire? They're going to have their 401k/403b money and Social Security and another personal savings. So it's really important that we really focus on this 401k aspect. But the question that this gentleman had was, what kind of paper trail is required by employers in California to show that they met the CalSavers requirements? What kind of paper trail do you have to have in place for that?
You know, I have to confess, I am not an expert in the implementation of CalSavers. My understanding, and John, you might know this better, my understanding is CalSavers applies if you don't have an employer-sponsored retirement plan. So if you have a 401k, if you have a 403b, essentially you just tell them you do and you're exempt from CalSavers, but you probably know more about the nuts and bolts than I do.
Yeah, yeah. As long as you have a retirement plan, you don't need a 401k or a 403b. You don't need to have CalSavers. Any other questions? Do we need to scroll down some more?
No other questions.
Oh, no other questions? Okay. I've got one. Just in your experience, looking at litigation, talking to plan sponsors, what are like maybe some of the 2 or 3 biggest speed bumps that you see that really disrupt the apple cart, that just make plan sponsors lose sleep overnight?
Yeah, so I mentioned before that fiduciaries are liable for making these decisions, but I didn't really dwell on exactly what that means. I mentioned some of the civil penalties that can be assessed for failure to file forms with the government or send notices to participants, and those are kind of regulatory, fees that come into being because you failed to do something. But as a fiduciary, you're liable for making these decisions. What does that mean? It's actually a pretty significant liability. ERISA has some real teeth. Fiduciaries are personally liable for making the plan whole if they breach their duties. And that's why it's so important you follow that prudent process, because again, you're not being held to a standard that says the plan must make money. You're being held to a standard that says I made a decision the proper way. In other words, the plan is being, my duty is met if I do things the right way, even if the market collapses. That's otherwise we'd be guaranteeing performance, right? And if you could guarantee performance of the financial markets, you're probably not going to be on this call because you have your own private island somewhere and you're doing quite well. No one can do that. So the law doesn't make you have to do that. But what that does mean is where you didn't do things the right way and there's a loss, then someone can bring private litigation saying, well, you breached your duty, and as a result of your breach, we were harmed. Now, the good news about ERISA is that you're not eligible for non-economic damages or punitive damages, sort of extra damages. You're liable for the actual loss caused. But, particularly in a large plan, that could actually be a pretty big number. And the types of common litigation we're seeing typically are involving issues about fees and investments. So, for example, fees, and it's worth spending a minute on this. Your duty as an ERISA fiduciary is to pay a reasonable fee. So when you hire a service provider or when you pick an investment, it's not to find the cheapest fee, it's to find a reasonable fee, which is a zone, not a point, right? So taking into account all the other factors, was the fee I paid for this investment reasonable? In other words, compared to what else I could be investing in, were the benefits of this and the costs, were they in the right balance such that it was a reasonable fee? And so we're seeing a lot of litigation over allegations that fees weren't reasonable. Again, the good news is, so far, the courts have made it very clear that the duty is not to pay the cheapest fee, but to show that you properly considered fees. So in other words, fees are one of the factors that you need to gather along with other information about investments, like its past performance, the tenure of its managers, all those other things you would normally look at. Fees have to be in the mix as well. But I do want to emphasize this: reasonableness is a different word. It is not a synonym for cheapest. And I think the best example is one that makes sense to all of us. Anyone who's ever dealt with a contractor to do some renovations to their home, There is not a person among us, I'm betting, who would hire a contractor solely because they were the cheapest bid they got. If you do that, that's a great way to not have a kitchen when you're renovating your kitchen for the next 18 months. You would look at fees, certainly. How much you pay for that contractor is an important factor, but you're also going to look at, do they show up? What are their, what do other people who've worked with them say about them? What's their experience with kitchens like mine? If my kitchen's in a high-rise condo, that's different than it's in a historic farmhouse. All of those factors you look at when hiring a contractor, and fees are important, but they're not the only factor. And so one of the key issues in litigation boils down to fees. So you need to show your prudent, thorough, well-documented process that you looked at fees as one of those. Others get into factors like I mentioned before. Did you follow what the plan told you to do? For example, if you did apply the wrong definition of compensation, that might mean that for the last 5 years, you've not been matching based on what you should have been matching on. So in other words, you didn't pay enough to all of your workers, and that can be a very expensive and difficult thing to fix. So looking kind of at fees, looking at the types of investments and the process by which you pick them, and looking at compliance with some of those key plan definitions are all some common issues we see in litigation.
When you look at different service providers out there, there's a lot of numbers thrown around, 316, 321, 338. Can you comment for the group on what those different what the different terminology means and what it means for a 401k plan and how it can help you?
Yeah, that's a great question because, one of the ways that people in ERISA, well, I guess we survive despite the jargon, but it also has all particular meanings. So let's those numbers you mentioned really are important. So the two biggest ones that you probably hear the most are 321 and 338. Why are they listed that way? Well, it's referring a section of the law that has definitions in it. So Section 3, Definition 21, is fiduciary investment advisor. And what that's come to mean when most folks use it is you're hiring someone who is going to give you investment recommendations, and they're going to be a fiduciary with you. In other words, they have co-fiduciary liability. When they say, I think you should invest in the following, your menu should have the following 12 items on it, or whatever the number is, they're saying, I've gone through the process. Here's what I did. I looked at all these factors, and out of those, I recommend these 12. So they are a fiduciary with you for that decision, but you still at the plan retain the authority to decide whether to follow their advice or not. So a 321 fiduciary is someone who will tell you what they think you should do, and then you decide whether or not you still want to do it. A 338 manager is where you hire someone to make investment decisions for you. In other words, you formally delegate to them your fiduciary authority to make that decision. So you're no longer picking the investments, you're picking the investment manager, and they are then picking the investments for you. You're still not off the hook. You're still liable as a fiduciary for selecting that 338 advisor, for making sure their fees are reasonable, and for periodically monitoring what they're doing to make sure they're actually doing things properly. But when it comes down to why was that fund selected, that's their responsibility to select that fund, not your responsibility to select that particular fund. So 321, someone gives you fiduciary advice and you decide. 338, you tell someone to do it for you. 316 is another number, and that refers to the fiduciary authority for a lot of these process sort of non-investment decisions. That's where you're saying someone has the decision to decide whether claims are going to be paid. Someone has the authority to file the Form 5500 and sign it as a fiduciary. Somebody is deciding whether loans are appropriate and should be granted in accordance with the plan terms. It's all the, not all, but it's a lot of the mechanical fiduciary functions, the administrative fiduciary functions. And when you hire a 316 administrator, you are, or a 316 fiduciary, what you're really hiring is someone to take responsibility for doing some of those administrative functions. And there are options that can merge sort of all of those together. I mentioned before with PEPs and MEPs, multiple employer plans, pooled employer plans. someone else is really both the 338 and the 316 in many cases. It's set up so that when you join them, they're making a lot of the administrative decisions and responsibility. They're doing a lot of the investment decisions and responsibility. And your responsibility is deciding whether you want to join, whether it's prudent to join, whether the fees are reasonable to join, and then sending the money timely so that your participants are getting the benefits that they're supposed to get. So again, this goes back to how much authority control do you want to have? Do you want your own plan done your way? Do you want to outsource some of these jobs to others? And the answer is very different depending on your company. That's why it's an individualized decision, and you have the flexibility to go different ways with it.
Yeah, when you look at also like ERISA 404A and 404C, or fiduciary duties and the protections from the investment decisions of the plan participants, a lot of times when you take a look at that in detail, it talks about having, making sure you're providing that investment education, retirement education to the plan participants. Can you comment about how important that is and what you see for companies that try to provide that?
Yeah, so just, I think 404C is a term worth exploring just a little bit. As another one of these, I know these are all jumbled together, but this one's important. What 404C says is that I, as a fiduciary, in like a 401k plan, where yes, I pick the investment menu and I'm the fiduciary for what options are available to you, but you, the individual participant, are deciding how to allocate your own account. So if you decide to put everything in one investment rather than spread it over several, or rather than using a target date fund, or rather than any of the other things you could do, if I'm a 404C plan, in other words, I have complied with the rules about 404C, then the participant is responsible for their own investment decisions, and I'm not responsible for their choices. I'm just responsible for my choices about the menu. If you don't comply with 404C, then you can be liable for the participants' decisions as well. And that's kind of a holdover from ERISA's early days, when it was more sort of traditional defined benefit pensions. As we've grown into more of the 401k, 403b system with individual decision making, 404c has become more important. So as you say, part of 404c is you need to declare on the Form 5500 that you are a 404c plan. You need to tell participants that in the summary plan description and the plan documents. You need to have a certain array of investments that are going to allow participants to arrange themselves across the risk-reward spectrum, so that they have enough investments to be able to select those different options. And part of that also is providing them with education about about the investments that are available to them. So you have information you have to provide about the investments, about their 1, 5, and 10-year performance histories, about their fees. So there's both information you have to give annually and disclose, and then there's information that's available on request. So those are part of the duties you need to comply with in order to make sure you're not responsible for their investment decisions. There's also general investment education, which a lot of plans provide either through their advisors or their record keepers, which tells participants things like why saving is important. It gives them tools to project how well they're going to save down the road. Some of this is optional, but it can be very important as well to help participants understand how to use the plan and make some of those decisions for themselves. They're going to have a big impact later.
Yeah, perfect. Anyone else have any questions? We got about 7 minutes left.
Well, maybe I'll mention one more thing if before somebody jumps in with another question, because we get this issue a lot. There's been some confusion because of the new law that just passed, Secure Act 2.0. It is now required for new retirement plans going forward that they're going to have automatic enrollment and auto escalation. That is still optional for plans that are older. In other words, plans that were started before, technically the date is December 29th of last year. If your plan started before December 29th of last year, auto enrollment and auto escalation are voluntary as a plan design. but they're mandatory for as a plan design going forward, and you have to comply with that by 2025. So we have a 2-year kind of transition window. Well, what is auto enrollment and auto escalation? What it is it's saying if a participant, and traditionally this is how it was, if you offered a 401k plan, you'd send out all the information to your participants to enroll them, and they'd then get a certain period of time to decide whether they wanted to join and what percent of contributions they wanted to make and what investments they wanted to put. And if they didn't make all those decisions affirmatively, well, they just weren't in the plan. So not knowing what to do became a decision. And generally speaking, in that type of environment, about 2/3 of workers signed up for a plan and about 1/3 didn't. Automatic enrollment flips that on its head, and it says, hey, unless you tell us no, because the participant always has the right to say no or to give different instruction, but unless you say no, or unless you tell us to do something else, we're going to put you in the plan. We're going to put you in at this percentage of contributions, and we're going to invest you in these investments called a qualified default investment alternative, sort of a default investment where you didn't get instruction. And in those cases, participation goes up to over 90%. And it stays there because what we've seen with over 10 years of real world experience with this on a voluntary basis is that employees wanted to be in the plan, they just didn't know what to do. So we're getting 90-95% participation rates with automatic enrollment. And what the new law says is that going forward, employers, plan sponsors will have to have automatic enrollment, and they have to start, they get to pick where, but they start somewhere between 6 and 10% of a participant's pay as the contribution. So that going forward, a plan would say to a new worker coming in, thanks for joining the company. We have a 401k. Unless you tell us no, we're going to put in 6% of your pay, and we're going to put it in this default investment. And you know, you have X amount of time to tell us to do something different. Auto escalation is the same thing, except once they're already enrolled, you're increasing their percentage of contribution by a small amount each year. So the new law says it goes up 1% until it gets to 10% or a maximum of 15. So if you defaulted me in at 6% as a new worker, next year it would be 7%, and the year after 8%. And you could either stop at 10 or carry on to 15. The reason Congress did that, and by the way, this was a bipartisan thing, all the Republicans and all the Democrats basically agreed on it, which hardly ever happens, is because the data shows this really works. People like saving. They don't unenroll themselves when they're automatically enrolled. They knew they should have been in the plan. And they don't start worrying about auto escalation, the data shows, till it gets to over 10%. So this has been a very effective technique on a voluntary basis for the last 10 or 15 years. It's now mandatory for new plans going forward. So depending on when you started your plan, you need to be aware of those distinctions and think about how you want to handle it.
Yeah, I think with all the laws, changes, disclosures you have to send out, keeping track of people for auto escalation and auto enrollment, sounds pretty nice to have an administrator take care of that for you.
Well, yeah, there are definitely advantages to that. It all comes down to, do you want some of this done for you, or do you want to control it and manage it yourself? And both of those are equally valid options. Just one's easier than the other. But it's something you have to look at and decide what makes sense for your individual plan. But absolutely, MEPs and PEPs and all of those pooled arrangements are increasingly popular by employers who want benefits but may not want to have the staff and time necessary to fully manage them.
Yeah, because I know a lot of organizations that I talk to, they're running lean and mean. So we got
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, again, this is one where every company can set it up to suit their own. So we've seen some incredibly customized plans because that's what they want. But we've also seen a lot of plan sponsors who say, yeah, I need a retirement plan. I see the value of it. I want one. But boy, my HR department is working hard to keep pace with what we have. My finance department is keeping us, afloat in this economy. We don't need to be doing all this ourselves if there's an easier option. But again, it's an individual choice. Doing it yourself or hiring someone to do it for you, provided you do it the right way, either way, is an equally valid choice.
Great. We got about 5 minutes left. Any other questions from folks in the audience or any comments? Or anyone here in the room? I think we're good.
Yeah, well, Brad, thank you so much
Thank you, Brad.
for joining us.
Appreciate your
today.
time.
Yep, and giving your insights to this and how important this is. And John, thank you for your time as well.
One quick question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Stacey. Go ahead, Stacy.
Okay, hi there. Yeah, I was just wondering, I try to explain to people when we first set up a plan that I'm going to link in with them and get their personal emails so we don't lose them. Because sometimes it happens, people leave and then they never follow up and they never respond to emails. So it would be good to know the true story of like what actually happens. I mean, I know they go somewhere to the government, but how can I explain to them so that not a scare tactic, but in effect, just this is the reality of why I need your info and why you should keep your address updated. What happens?
Yeah, actually, what we call missing participants is a huge problem, both for the participants and for the plan sponsors who have to deal with, as you say, folks change jobs, they move around, they retire, they go to Florida. Well, probably not from California. They're probably not going to Florida. Maybe they go to Puerto Vallarta. I don't know. But on the East Coast, they go to Florida. Anyway, my point is you lose track of them. And in that case, somebody might have left behind, $6,000 or $7,000 or $8,000 in an account that they don't necessarily realize is there. Or let's say they left behind $5,000.
I just found a woman who I did locate and she has 50 and she had no idea.
Yeah, well, if you left a job 25 years ago and it had several $1,000s in the account and it was invested in sort of something exposed to equities, it would not be at all surprising for that to have become a substantial amount of money in the meantime because it just sat there and compounded.
Right.
And you're right, that's money they're leaving behind, and that's a very good reason to do it. Also, for plan sponsors, this is an issue because the Labor Department takes the position that you have a fiduciary duty to furnish these disclosures on an annual basis. And if you've lost touch with the participant, you can't do that. So they say you have a duty to sort of take reasonable efforts to try to find these folks. Now, it's not 100% clear what those reasonable efforts are. DOL put out guidance that lists several different approaches that you can try. But it isn't a checklist. It's not like you can say, well, if I've done these 5 things, I am no longer liable for this missing participant. It's a little more convoluted than that. And so DOL has actually started doing a lot of investigations. And what they're really looking at are folks who are at retirement required minimum distribution age, which is 72, or normal retirement age, which can be much lower for a traditional pension plan. They're looking at those folks in your plan saying, well, how many people are supposed to be taking distributions or getting benefits because they're old enough now and aren't? And if they aren't, why not? What have you done to try to find them? And those can be very expensive investigations. Actually, over half of DOL's civil recoveries right now for retirement plans relate to this single issue. So yeah, if you can voluntarily get information from people so they don't get lost, that's beneficial. Another good thing to do is to talk to your record keeper about a program that most of them have to try and find missing participants, whether that's credit record searches, death record searches, because sometimes you have to try to find the heirs of these folks. Those are all things that you can do. You mentioned sending information to the government. The new Secure Act that just passed here in December does have a new requirement that in the next 2 years, DOL will start a national database. Department of Labor will start a national database where you can send those names, but it's not yet built. And I question whether they'll get it done in the next 2 years. So there are things happening in this space, but you're really very right to think about this because it's an issue that causes a lot of problems.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that detail. But so you're saying that it goes to Department of Labor?
Well, actually, no. What'll go to the Department of Labor under this new provision, and of course, they haven't written the rule yet, so we don't know the nuance, but what it says in the statute is DOL will create a database of those people's names and the contact information for the plans they used to be, that they're still affiliated with, so that I, as an individual, let's say I'm sitting at home in Florida when I'm retired and I'm looking this up, I can say, do I have any old 401ks I don't know about? I could go to the DOL website, look it up and say, well, here's who I should call at the ABC company where I worked back in the 80s to
Right.
see if they have a benefit for me. We're still several years from that being live. And also, frankly, I think it's backwards. The problem in the real world is not me, the participant, trying to find my old accounts. Often I don't even know they're there. The problem in the real world is plan sponsors who have all these missing participants that they can't find. So I think Congress missed the boat and did this backwards, but still this new program may be helpful down the road.
I mean, I have found like on LinkedIn, I can find other people that are linked with these people and I'll say, will you reach out? But I mean, I have one that's going to be shutting down at the end of the year. And so I'm worried about that. And the other question is, like my broker dealer won't let me open up an IRA rollover if someone's outside of the country. So it's again, another problem is like, I don't know if Schwab or other places will let them open up something outside the country, but it seems kind of a difficult, even if I did find the person, I don't know what to do with their money. If they're.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to, that I think is something you're gonna have to look at on a case by case basis, but just in general, the rule before was if someone had $5,000 or less in the account, there was sort of a fiduciary safe harbor regulation that would protect you for opening an IRA in their name to roll the money out. And the reason that was good for everybody is you had reduced fiduciary risk and they didn't have a taxable distribution because by rolling it to an IRA instead of to a state escheatment fund, for example,
Right.
you didn't trigger the taxes. So that was a good thing. In the Secure Act, they did increase that from 5,000 to 7,000, which
Okay.
on the one hand isn't a huge number, on the other hand is better than nothing. So it didn't address the out of country issue, but that is an option, is to take some of those smaller balances and, maybe during a dip in the market, see if you can roll those out for people you haven't been able to find.
Right. Okay. Great. Thank
Great.
you.
All right,
All right.
great.
Thank you so much, Brad.
Thank you so much, Brad. For everyone on the call here, this was supposed to be our kickoff to our new MEP plan that the Chamber is a new benefit for members. And it's the first in a series of events we hope to have to kind of educate you on your retirement plan options, etc. So thank you so much for joining us today. I just wanted to let you know we do have a couple more events coming up. We have tomorrow is the San Francisco Downtown's Current Leasing Environment Data Deep Dive, and that's Team Helpy is here in the office.
It's right here, but it's also going to be a hybrid.
It's going to be a hybrid as well. So if you check out our calendar, you can be able to register for that. Next Tuesday is our annual City Beat Breakfast, and I believe that's selling out pretty quickly. So jump online and make sure you get a ticket for that. It should be a very interesting and packed event for us. And then on July 11th, we have our member orientation and networking event right here in our offices at 235 Montgomery. So any other questions, visit our website at sfchamber.com, and thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, John, very much.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.